Good morning, everybody, from a very sunny Edenbridge. It's a beautiful day out there, and I bid you welcome to Home Cinema Essentials 1 and 2. This is part of a three-part session that we will be doing. The next one is next Monday. As you can see, my name is Justin Martin Lawrence, and I'm the Technical Manager of Habitech Limited. I'm a bit of a veteran. I've been in our industry for 29 years. In AV and CI, and I manage all the aspects of technical at Habitech. I'm also currently running technical support during the COVID-19 outbreak. This is Home Cinema Essentials Modules 1 and 2. If you have any questions you'd like answered, of course, we'll be stopping during this webinar for questions. But if there's anything after this webinar, please do send any questions into training@habitech.co.uk, because it helps us form these webinars and make them more informative to you. As you can imagine, with home cinema, there's an awful lot to cram into a webinar, and there are many things that we can't do practically. Before we start, a little bit of webinar lore. For those of you who are not familiar with the Zoom webinar system, if you're having any issues with audio, if you scroll down towards the bottom of your screen, you'll see on the bottom left there's an audio settings caption, and if you click that, you can adjust your audio and output devices. Jonathan Pengilly will be co-paneling today, and we will take breaks during the webinar for questions. If you think of a question during the webinar, please click the Q&A icon, and it will queue those questions up for us to go through during the breaks. Please try and avoid using the chat window because it flashes up in front of everybody and it can be a little bit distracting. So we'd rather use the Q&A if you can. By all means, continue the chat after the webinar. So let's get started. Our course objectives today are to look at commercial opportunities with home cinema, understand the difference between surround sound, home cinema, and home theatre, creating the right home theatre environment, calculating and specifying the right speakers and amplification for that, looking at subwoofer placement, and discussing room calibration. Habitech's approach to home cinema is to provide courses and training to help you prevent lost sales through underselling and underspecifying systems. As you know, we partner with the best brands and products in their class to provide the best solutions, and we don't just stop at shifting boxes or providing online and in-house training. We also help you specify and design your cinemas. We have a cinema design service, and we're expanding that to offer more and more capabilities for you. So please, we provide extensive support. Do use it in all aspects of design of your home cinema from start to end. So before we start on the tech stuff, let's have a look at the commercial opportunities of home cinema. This is a skill that you will own. Designing and installing home cinema systems is not a commodity item that your customer can pick up in a department store. And in this day and age, accepting obviously the social restrictions right now, it's very, very easy for customers to walk into a large department store and pick up what they think is a home cinema. But a real home cinema, or home theatre as I prefer to call it, is a properly designed acoustic and visual environment for your customers to enjoy. It's a significant investment. You are designing part of someone's home, and a well-designed cinema is going to bring great upgrade opportunities in the future, is generally low maintenance, and is something that your customers will provide other customers from by demonstrating and sharing that experience with their friends. Think like a German car manufacturer. Build your cinemas on the concept of reliability. Don't add in fiddly boxes and cables. Don't make it more complicated than it needs to be for the customer to use. Remember, this is something the customer will want to use in their downtime. So standardize the infrastructure for all the cinemas you do. Make them upgradable, make them simple, make them reliable. And to help your customer choose their cinema, rather than just going in with the biggest quote you possibly can and the risk that you might lose that, break down the features into chargeable add-on options, just like car manufacturers do when you want to add in things like upgraded audio systems, visual systems, etc. Technology waits for no one. So when you're putting in that cinema, sell in future-proof. Consider technologies like fiber. Make sure you're not using an HDMI format to the projector that's going to be legacy in a year's time. And make return visits a pleasure. You should only need to return to the home cinema to upgrade it or to enhance the customer's experience with extra features like lighting or motorized curtains. You shouldn't be going back to maintain in a repair sense, anything about that cinema. One of the biggest things that is difficult to differentiate in front of customers is the difference between surround sound, home cinema, and home theatre. So let's have a look at the differences between those. Most customers still have preconceptions about what a cinema is, and that's because a few companies have marketed their product very well to make their product look like an ideal home cinema environment. We all know about wireless sound bars and surround sound products. And while they're quite often practical and retrofittable, they should never be a replacement for dedicated speakers set at the correct angles and a properly calibrated system. The difference in audio is chalk and cheese. Home cinema kits, like the one you see on the right, are very generic and they're often bought as bundles or thrown in with television systems to be placed in a room where it's convenient. It's not a substitute for a well-planned, well-prepared room. And very often these cinema systems, although they claim to have Atmos capabilities, do not. They often have imbalanced audio characteristics. They don't take into account the size of the room. They literally are a throw in and fit it solution. They're really just one step up from the wireless solution we saw in step one. A real home cinema, what I like to call home theatre, is a designed and calculated solution. And that's what you're going to learn about on this course. Attention's made to aesthetics, furnishing, lightings, and acoustics. And the installation and calibration takes several days, but the end result is a phenomenal home cinema experience that your customers will treasure. And it's also something that you're going to be able to go in and upgrade and improve time and time again as technologies change. Don't forget, we're right in the middle of the 4K era, but 8K is just around the corner. So that's going to mean projector changes, there are audio system upgrades, there are wider technologies in terms of how media is distributed, and all of these things are sales opportunities for you. So what's the most important factor in a cinema room design? The room. And in that, you need to consider the volume and size, the fabric and construction, natural light control, shape, and room usage. We don't often get an opportunity to choose the size of a room, and there isn't such a thing as a perfect room, but acoustically there are formulas which closely follow what's known as the golden ratio, which is for many things in nature and science. We're going to cover this in more detail in the second module later on this morning, but the general ratio is that height becomes 0.62 times the width, and length becomes the width times 1.62. The biggest restriction we often have in home cinema or home theatre is the room height. And historically, certainly for houses up to 100 years old, room height is generally set at around 2.4 meters high. That's why plasterboard comes in 2.4 meter lengths. So for a 2.4 meter high room, width is 2.4 divided by 0.62. So that's a 4 meter room, wide room, and it creates a length of 6.5 meters. If you have an older Victorian style house or a modern house where they're starting to increase the height of ceilings in living spaces, then the width would be 2.8 meters divided by 6, which is 4.7 meters, and the length is 7.6 meters. We tend to see the average size of rooms around 4 by 6 meters or 5 by 8 meters. But we're going to come on to that in more detail in module 2. And amongst the downloads that you're going to get with this webinar package, there are a number of calculators, white papers, and free utilities that we've created for you to help you design the ultimate cinema for your customer. The other consideration is fabric construction and noise. Home theatres make a lot of noise. Sounds obvious, but a lot of people don't think about that when they're designing rooms. It's not just about the noise coming out of the room, it's also about making the room acoustics as good as possible to create the best cinema environment. One of the products that you can use, and again, there are application notes in the package that comes with this webinar, is a product called Green Glue, which you can use to create isolated panels inside a cinema room, combined with things like Gyprock Sound Block or many other plasterboard products that are specifically designed for acoustic environments to help isolate the room and stop the noise coming out of it. What you do is you create a sandwich of green glue between two boards of Gyprock Sound Block or equivalent, and the inner board you actually isolate by not having it right the way to the floor and ceiling. You leave a gap around it, which you fill with compound, and that also helps isolate the sound. Home theatres have a lot of speakers and kit, and one of the other considerations is the aesthetics of the room. For the more tech-savvy people and the people that don't mind technology around, it's all very well having speakers dotted everywhere, but don't forget that in a modern system, you're very likely to have 7 speakers around you, you're going to have subwoofers that you're going to have to carefully place, and you're going to have speakers above you. One of the two of the things that can have a positive effect on this aesthetically is using acoustic fabric walls, and the second is to use perforated or acoustically transparent screens. Acoustic fabric walls are fantastic because they disguise the speakers without compromising performance, because the cloth is designed to pass audio frequencies. The other thing that's great about that is it makes it very, very easy to hide things like wiring and lighting and make the room look better. It's also great because you can choose darker colors, which are very easy to fabricate. And the picture on the right is actually our, what we call VIP Cinema 2, our Sonance room, which actually has a dark brown cloth with wooden niches set in the wall for accessories. Darker colors work much better with projectors because projectors, no matter how good they are, output or end up providing less light than television screens do. And we're going to come on to a lot of the science behind that in module 3 next Monday. Themed subtle lighting and light timing are going to make the room much more comfortable for the viewer. When you're creating a room, you're going to be creating a dark room for a proper home theatre. And the thing with that is that the eyes have to adjust to the darkness of the room. So the last thing you want is a 60 or 100 watt bulb or a set of halogens suddenly flicking on at the end of the film. You need to add timing, you need to add subtle lighting so that people can find their way around the room during a film. And you need to be able to time the lighting so that you can bring it back up slowly after the film or when the film pauses. Furthermore, you can add value to that by integrating it with control systems so that, for example, when you press pause or stop, the room returns very slowly to its conventional daylight lighting condition. The other thing we need to consider in any cinema is natural light control. Sometimes we just cannot tame it enough. Too much natural light can kill a home theatre experience, especially when you're using projectors. So consider integrating motorized blinds for smaller window apertures and linking that control with the lighting. Try thinking about blackout curtains on a motorized track if you have to completely darken the room. And if the room is multi-purpose, what I'd call a media room, where perhaps you want to include a projector, but you also want a daytime viewing option, then consider adding an LCD or OLED behind the screen. But do remember that, first of all, LCDs and OLEDs are not ideally placed behind transparent screens, because quite often with the projection light, you can see their reflection through the perforation. And also that with OLED screens, They do give fantastic contrast, but they do not give the brightness that conventional LED sets do. So if in a bright room, look very carefully at the light output of the television and consider whether it's going to provide enough light for the viewing. Again, we will be covering a lot of the science behind light and transmission in Module 3. Choosing the right speakers for the room. If you look at our room here, you'll see we've got a couple of little active speakers up on the top left and right of the screen. And whilst I photoshopped these in, it's actually not the first time I've seen them in so-called cinema installations. In the picture, we can tell visually that fitting this speaker in the room is not going to make a great home theatre. First thing that's wrong is that it's mounted up in the corner. But the second problem is that it's a very small speaker for a big room. And part of the problem with that is the amount of sound it can produce and the frequencies that it can reproduce. So how do we calculate this? Well, luckily for us, Dolby Atmos or Dolby Labs provide Atmos specifications for home cinema. And it's Dolby Atmos specifications that you should be following for any cinema, regardless of the audio standards that you're using, because they're the most exacting and they fit in with all of the other audio standards that are out there right now. So for example, if you're using DTS:X, that's completely compliant inside the Dolby Atmos specifications. So in the spec, Dolby Labs have allowed for frequency response and sound pressure level. Sound pressure level is measured at the reference listening position, which is known as the RLP. And that's the sweet spot in a cinema, which is usually in the center of the front row of seats, the primary sitting position, or just behind the primary sitting position if there are larger cinemas, so that more of the audience gain the benefit of the surround effect. If you ever see RLP in a document, it refers to the reference listening position. And if you look at the Dolby Atmos document on the right-hand side, you'll see that the sound pressure level should be 105 decibels at the RLP. Moving on to formulas, if we look at the specification sheet on the right-hand side of this page, you'll see that the Sonance Reference 1 frequency response exceeds the Dolby Atmos specification. So we know that this speaker is ideal for a home cinema environment. And we can also see that it has a sensitivity of 90 decibels. What does that mean? Well, what it means is it's a standardized measurement. All speaker manufacturers provide a standardized sensitivity level that's based on a 2.83 volt sine wave, creating 1 watt of power to the speaker. And you'll find that whenever any manufacturer gives you a sensitivity, that is the measurement they've taken it at. And you'll find that there'll be an enormous variance in sensitivity. Some loudspeakers might be as low as 75 or 80 decibels, and other speakers may be as high as 105 or 112. But generally speaking, adjustments in sensitivity also tend to adjust the amount of power that a speaker can actually cope with. And they also are affected by the design of the speaker. So if we've got a 90 dB sensitivity speaker, how do we get to Dolby's 105 decibel reference point at the RLP? 90 decibels is the sound pressure level at 1 meter from the speaker. And Dolby's Atmos design specification tells us that the longest distance between the speaker and the RLP is going to be at the front. Science and maths tells us that with conventional point source loudspeakers, that's speakers with conventional drive units and tweeters, we lose 6 decibels of sound pressure level every time that distance is doubled. And that formula is absolutely standardized across any type of loudspeaker that is point source. So in the picture that I've created on the right-hand side, we can see our customer sitting 4 meters from the front speakers. If we know that the loss doubles every time the distance doubles, we find that at 4 meters, in fact, the sound pressure level loss will be something like 12 decibels. So if the SPL of the speaker, the RPL is 90 dB minus 12 dB, we end up with a 78 dB signal. So to achieve this, we need to create a gain of 27 dB to bring it back up to 105 dB. You'll be pleased to know that in the download pack that comes with this webinar, I'm also providing you with a number of calculators to calculate things like this. And the formula for amplification is that for every extra 10 dB of power you need, you have to multiply the output power by 10. So we find that if the front left, front right, and center speakers are 300 watts per channel, are receiving 300 watts for each channel, then we fall within the listening position SPL of 107.4 dB. So we're 2.4 dB above it. But very importantly, can the speakers handle this? And hold that thought, because I'm going to talk about Dolby's reference for home cinema later on in this module. And while we're talking about that, we also need to look at speaker layouts. Again, in the documentation I'm providing, I'm giving you the Dolby reference layouts. And Dolby refer to things in the terms 7.1.4 or number. The first number represents the number of speakers that surround you. And generally speaking, that will be 5, 7, or 9. So most obviously, let me just bring up the laser pointer. That will be front left, front center, front right, side effect, and rear surround. So in this case, we have 7 loudspeakers around us. The 1 represents how many subwoofers you have connected, and quite often you might hear bigger cinemas having perhaps 7.4.4, and I'm going to explain how that works later on in this webinar. And then finally, the 4 at the end represents the number of speakers that are above the listener. And they're very carefully aligned using angles, and I'll show you some of the diagrams for how you can calculate this in a few slides' time. So what's the difference between real cinema and home cinema or home theatre? Well, in this example, I'm going to use Dolby's Atmos system, which is the most complex audio system and the most standardized in cinemas today. The basic principles are the same for all soundtracks regardless. So if it's DTS, that's the same. Commercial cinemas are larger spaces. It means that there's a requirement for a higher speaker count so that individuals can experience the effect better. And in the Dolby Atmos specification for cinemas and theaters, there can actually be a speaker count of up to 64 speakers. But this is in a commercial environment. One of the most common misconceptions about the channel count in Dolby Atmos is that there are actually 64 different soundtracks. And probably one of the cleverest things about Atmos's design is that it's backward compatible with practically every speaker arrangement. Dolby Atmos, in truth, actually works by having a maximum main soundtrack of up to 9.1 channels plus objects. And that enables backward compatibility with conventional 7.1 and 5.1 systems, because the rendering device, which is the processor or the AVR, can decide how the soundtrack is rendered. And the Atmos soundtrack can be presented either as a mix in the main speakers, or it can be presented as a mix in main surround, or it could be mixed into main, surround, and height. This is why Dolby Atmos is actually a metadata extension to the Dolby True HD soundtrack. So you might remember, those of you that have got home cinemas, that it was only about 5 or so years ago, perhaps a little bit longer, that we were used to using Dolby True HD or DTS HD soundtrack standards not Dolby Atmos or DTS:X. And in fact, Dolby Atmos and DTS:X are actually carried inside the audio stream of their counterparts. So in fact, Dolby Atmos is actually carried inside the Dolby True HD soundtrack. And Atmos is simply a metadata extension. It is not a soundtrack, it's metadata that tells the renderer where to place objects. And that's how Dolby can create a 3D audio environment. So as you can see on the right-hand side, how it's actually presented is beds of sound, up to 9.1 of those. So that would be 9 audio channels plus an LFE, low frequency, and then up to 118 objects. And when you combine them together, and regardless of how you render them, they end up as an Atmos experience. And the same is exactly the same is true of the DTS:X sound format. When we bring Dolby Atmos into home cinema or home theater, the actual maximum channel count is 24.1.10. So it reduces from the 64 in the cinema. If you're using an environment in 24.1.10, then the chances are, well, sensibly, it will be in a large room. It will probably be in somewhere between a residential and commercial environment. And in the majority, most Atmos systems actually generally have a 7-channel main track. And an environment of this size, you're going to need more subwoofers. Remember, the main soundtrack, regardless of the amount of speakers, can only have 9 channels. And a little known fact is that the majority of films are actually only mixed with 7 main soundtrack channels right now. You can find this information on a filterable list that's available at blu-raystats.com, and I've left a link at the bottom of this page for you to get that information. It's very useful when you're creating presentations for your customers. Also, contrary to popular belief, there's actually only one LFE channel in either Dolby or DTS systems. It's worth knowing that processors only use the LFE output when the frequency is below the capability of the main speakers. And this is why when you set up the AVR or the processor, you choose the speaker type carefully. Quite often it will be referred to as small and large. And in general, you will always choose small because most loudspeakers cannot go down to the frequencies that are required for Dolby Atmos or DTS:X or any surround system that has a sub or LFE channel. And once you do that, the processor automatically chooses where LFE channels are sent. And at some frequencies, that can actually be a mix between the main speaker and the subwoofers. So if there's only one LFE channel, why do we see 9.24 or 9.46 systems? It's simply because with low frequencies, every octave that the frequency moves down, we need to move twice the amount of air. And obviously, the excursion and size of the speaker reference how much air that loudspeaker can move. What you'll find with subwoofer drivers is that very often the excursion, which is the amount the driver can move in and out, is significantly more than a conventional driver. And it means that the driver is not very good at reproducing higher frequencies, which is basically not a problem for a subwoofer. Due to the wavelength of lower frequencies, subwoofer placement and phase is really, really important. We need to move a lot of air at low frequencies, and you can end up with problems with cancellation. And I'm going to give you a bit more information on this in a while, but software like Room EQ Wizard is your friend here. It's a free of charge application which enables you to simulate and calculate where and how many subwoofers you might want to install in an installation. Low frequencies require more air movement. So to move more air requires more energy, or quite simply, more amplifier power. And if you have a look on the right-hand side, you can see the difference in sound waves between a high frequency and a low frequency. And we can use the speed of sound in our formulas to work out wavelength. And the speed of sound varies at temperature. So generally speaking, when we're calculating cinemas, we always look at the 20°C temperature, which means that the speed of sound is 343 meters per second. Now, keep that in mind, because when you get to lower frequency, placement of subwoofers becomes more difficult. Just sticking subs in the corners and hoping for the best is most likely not to work and not to give you a particularly good result with home cinema. If you use the formula on the right, you'll work out very quickly that a 40 hertz sound wave is actually 8.58 meters long, which means it probably exceeds the size of the room. One of the things that many people say, and it is true, is that at low frequencies, the human brain cannot distinguish sound direction. And just to explain why that is because the ears can only distinguish differences in where sound is coming from if the distance between the ear and the frequency is different on both sides. And of course, at lower frequencies with an 8.58 meter sound wave, there's no way the ear is going to be able to do that. So it's true to say that at low frequencies, the human brain can't distinguish sound direction, but that doesn't mean that subwoofer placement isn't important. When you start to get lower frequencies, as you can see in the computer rendering I've put on the right, you start to get a thing called standing waves. And standing waves tend to exist below 300 hertz. Standing waves are also known as room modes, and they're the collection of resonances that exist when a room is excited by the frequency of loudspeakers. So the responses affect low frequency and low mid-frequency response, generally below 300 hertz, and they cause noticeable increased volume in some areas and decreased volume in other areas, and also cause resonating sound waves, ringing, which is what you can see where the two sound waves collide just now in the animation. So this is one of the reasons why room shape and size, which I alluded to earlier in the presentation, are important. You can see on the right-hand side, I've emulated sound waves in the orange curves. And there is no one size fits all for home theatre. It's a complicated calculation, and it also involves many, many things like the characteristics of the materials that are used in building the room. There are a couple of rules. First of all, if you avoid cube-shaped rooms, it's going to help you a lot. You don't want the width, height, and length of the room to be equal. You really want to be ideally looking for a rectangular room. And if you possibly can, use one of the recommended room size ratios. On the right-hand side of the page, you'll see that there's a table. That table is actually from one of the downloads that's coming with this webinar. And in that table, you can enter the height of the room. And then I've put down on the left-hand side all of the different references and recommendations. And in general, Sepp Mayer's recommendations are ideal. He created 3 back in the 60s for acoustic environments. So I've highlighted those in green. And there's also a Dolby Labs reference recommendation, which is not dissimilar at all from Sepp Mayer's, which I've highlighted in blue. So try and use this, it will help you. Obviously, you can't always design the size and shape of a room, but you do need to take into account things like acoustics, look at things like green glue, and look at things like acoustic treatment, which I'm going to come on to in a minute. What if you can't choose the right room shape and size? Well, first of all, there's software and utilities built into higher end processors and amplifiers like Arcam and Wisdom, and also Aspect. So there's Dirac, which is a very, very widely acknowledged audio calibration system, which comes as standard on the likes of Arcam and Wisdom. There's also the Aspect system that comes on the ACT4 processor that we use. And what those utilities do is they measure the room by passing frequencies through the speakers. and then make adjustments to the amplifier to try and get the room as accurate as possible. In many cases, you'll probably also need to consider using acoustic treatment, and it's a great way to get the cinema up to spec, but it's not something you can just nail anywhere. That's something that needs some pretty clever calculation. We offer a system by Cinematech called ARS. We can help design your cinema using the ARS system and provide you with the acoustic panels that you're going to need to put in the room. Remember, if you're wanting to install acoustic panels to get the room to the right requirements, then using not just using acoustic treatment, but also using fabric treatment will help disguise that room treatment and keep the room looking nice. If you provide us with a dimension drawing, we can calculate exactly what you need as part of a bespoke cinema service that we offer. This is actually a thing. Subwoofers are difficult to place, and there's a thing called the subwoofer crawl. If you're using a freestanding subwoofer in a cinema environment, then you can work out a really good placement method by using the law of inverses. That is to say, if you place the subwoofer where you're going to sit and you move around the room or crawl around the room and use a tone generator like the one included in Room EQ Wizard to create a low frequency, say 40 Hertz, then as you crawl around the room, you'll hear spots where the bass sounds crisp and clear. And these are the ideal spots to locate one or more subwoofers. So you can find some information on that on YouTube. It's really simple. You just put the subwoofer where you're listening, play a sound through that subwoofer at a low frequency, and then crawl around the room to find the right spot. However, if you're designing a home cinema and you're trying to provide plans for customers, crawling around the room doesn't particularly look very professional. And if you're using CI products which are in wall, planning is much better. So referring again to Room EQ Wizard, it has a simulator which allows you to enter the size of the room, to add and remove subwoofers. You'll see in this diagram on the right-hand side, I've in fact put 4 subwoofers in, 2 next to each other at the back of the room. And you can emulate those settings and find the correct curves for setting up the room. These lines in the diagram are the standing waves I'm referring to. You will find a plethora of education on Room EQ Wizard. As I said, the software itself is free of charge. There's a Mac and Windows version. You're going to want to start to use things like calibration microphones to help you with that. And I'm going to come on to some of that a bit later on. If you want to download Room EQ Wizard, it's available on roomeqwizard.com. And don't forget, I'm going to be providing you with a complete copy of this PowerPoint presentation so that you can refresh yourself on it. I'm also going to be providing you with this video from today. Before I go on, I'm just going to pause and have a look and see if we've got any questions. We have one from Ali which says, where do you find a download pack? What will happen is after this presentation, you'll, within a day, so it takes about 24 hours, you'll receive a download link. And that download link is going to take you to our SharePoint site, and it's going to give you a complete categorized folder section, which you can download, which, as I said, has the video from today. It has the original PowerPoint presentation, and it has the calculators and white papers that I'm mentioning along the way. Just a reminder, do please try and come along to Module 3. So this is Modules 1 and 2 you're watching right now. Module 3 next week is going to take you into a lot of the science about screen sizes, projection calculations, audio codecs, quite a lot of extra stuff over and above what we're going through today. Now we need to consider speaker placement, and one of the great things about Dolby is they are really, really good at providing documentation, and I'm going to share that with you in the pack that comes out tomorrow. So they give you angles and references for all types of setups, and you'll see in a lot of the stuff that I'm providing, including information on all the different layouts, and you'll also see some of the calculators and graphical representations I've done to help create cinema. So in general, in speaker placement, we use Dolby's reference, and Dolby Atmos has specific loudspeaker quantities, placement points, and angles, which we saw in that 7.1.4 I was explaining earlier. DTS:X works differently, but uses the same principles. You choose the speaker count and placement. The calibration process sets the system up according to the AVR that you're using. So, for example, if you install 7.1.4 and you then use the DTS calibrator built into your AVR, it will automatically use the speaker placement that you've set to create the correct acoustic environment. In both cases, Dolby's references are the best method, so follow them as closely as possible. It's not always possible to follow it exactly, but if you follow it as close as you can, you're going to be able to create the best soundtrack. Of course, once you've installed and set up a Dolby Atmos system, any AVR or processor worth its salt will be using something like Dirac, which is pretty much known as the de facto acoustic measurement software, and that will help calibrate the amplifier to distance and frequency response. One thing that's worth knowing as well is while we talk about Dolby and DTS, whilst the two are completely different companies, you'll find that certainly in this day and age, there is a massive increase in the provision of OTT services over broadcast, which is basically things like Netflix, Amazon, Hulu, Apple TV, etc. And all of those services use Dolby, not DTS for soundtracks. And many of those now provide Dolby Atmos, which is actually compressed in a format called Dolby Plus. So while it's not quite as good as Blu-ray, it's pretty good, and it will be detected and redistributed by your AVR, or processed by your AVR as Dolby Atmos. There are specific rules for how loudspeakers should be used in an installation. And those are, first of all speakers should be full range and timbre matched. So in the old days with home cinema systems, and certainly in some of the cheaper stuff that you find as commodity items in department stores, you'll quite often find that the loudspeakers that are used for left, centre and right have a different performance level to those around. Now with the Dolby Atmos standard, actually the specification of the loudspeakers should match as closely as possible, regardless of whether they are front, whether they are side, rear, or top surround or overhead surround. So the speakers that are located in a room should be pointed at the reference point, obviously from the front, and should be set at 22 to 40 degree offset from the reference listening position. So basically the center speaker faces the listener, and the left and right need to be angled at 22 to 40 degrees away from the central point of the RLP. Now, it's important to know that when you look at this diagram, it looks like you're actually angling the speakers into the room. And while that can be true with freestanding speakers, don't think that in-wall speakers don't fall within Dolby specification. They do actually have reference specifications which follow exactly the same angles, and you need to position them either side or behind the screen. Also, you might find, and this is controversial because most thoughts on this have changed over the last few years, that sometimes it's impractical to put a center speaker in. Some people use the kind of smiley face format of using a left and a center under the screen and a right. But quite often, if the center isn't positioned where it should be, then you're actually better off using what's known as phantom mode, which means you don't use the center speaker. And again, we can help you do that when we help you design your rooms. The height of the center and front speakers should be at the listener ear level, which is generally speaking 1.2 meters. And all of the other speakers that are in the listening plane should be equidistant and should be at the same height. The only exception Dolby allow is that the rear speakers can be up to 1.25 times the front height, but ideally should be on the same plane. When we look at the front and surround placement, you will see that the optimum distance from the front speakers is often defined by the optimum viewing distance and Dolby reference angles. Now, what you'll find next week when we start going through viewing distances is that there are a number of standards, and they're certainly very, very important in cinema. And you're going to find that at some point you're going to have to find some mixed compromise between where the Dolby Atmos specification says your listener should be and where the viewing position says your listener should be. And this is where you need to very carefully consider the screen sizes you use, and where quite often it might be altered by the size and proportion of the room. But this is all stuff that we're going to go through next week. When it comes to height placements, overhead is a vital part of Dolby Atmos and DTS:X. So if you can, always use heights. There is an exception at the bottom of this page that we're going to come to. Use overhead speakers, make sure they're timber matched. Don't start using cheap in ceilings because you happen to find them in the back of your van. You do need to use speakers of the same caliber and quality as the front, rear and sides. They need to be full range. They need to have wide dispersion. So any speaker worth its salt will have that. So we have reference one ceilings which do that. And they'll need to have a wide dispersion of 45 degrees. There are some specialist narrower dispersion models, things like the ICS7s by Wisdom, which are fantastic, really, really good loudspeaker. If you install those, just focus the high level at the RLP. So in the case of ICS7s, you want to tilt them inwards slightly, but still position them at the 45-degree angle. Height is absolutely critical, and the minimum height for Atmos heights is 2.4 meters. You can have 2.3 meters if you use Atmos enabled speakers or add-on modules like those on the bottom right of this page, but we don't recommend those. They're really a kind of bodge to get around the fact that some people can't install in-ceiling speakers, and they rely on firing sound at the ceiling and reflecting off the ceiling, which brings in all sorts of acoustic nightmares into the environment. So avoid at all costs if you can. If you find that the ceiling height of your cinema is lower than 2.3 meters, I would not recommend installing in-ceiling speakers, and consider putting a wider dispersion of perhaps 9 channels around the room. The other thing is don't exceed 3.6 meters. So if the height of the room exceeds 3.6 meters, you want to consider using things like the Sonance pendant speakers so that you can bring the heights down to an acceptable level, or side mounted speakers at the worst case. Again, we can help you in our cinema design service to specify this. Here's a bigger diagram of the height placement angles that you would use for Dolby Atmos. And it gives you a very good calculation for what the height should be and where the speakers should be placed. So now we've fitted the speakers, we need to look at amplification, and we're going to refer back to the Dolby standard for the RLP decibel level. So in the original Dolby Atmos document that we saw, you'll remember that I said that the loudspeaker system and associated amplification required a maximum SPL of 105 dB at the reference listening position. And when we used the calculator calculating loss, we saw that we needed to produce 300 watts per channel for the front left, front right, and center speaker. And this is where Dolby have had to relax their standards, because while that is true in proper cinemas and theaters, you're not going to find a commodity system that's capable of sustaining that kind of power level or SPL at the RLP. So Dolby have relaxed the standard slightly for Atmos in the home, but you should still, on higher end cinemas, be aiming to hit that 105 dB level. We certainly have in our Wisdom Theatre at Habitech and also in the Sonance Theatre. It can be done, you just need to use the right speakers and the right amplification. Do bear in mind that when an amplifier manufacturer gives you their maximum output, that may well be at the cost of clipping with loudspeakers. So you need to over-specify amplification regardless of the requirements to make sure that you don't end up with distortion at high volume levels and thus return visits to replace or repair speakers. So Dolby's home theatre installation guidelines state that the target SPL can be 79 to 82 dB at the central listening position when driven with pink noise with a level of minus 20 dB relative to full scale. So what that actually means is that the SPL at the reference listening position should be 99 to 102 decibels rather than 105 decibels. And because the increase in decibel is exponential, obviously that can make quite a big difference. If instead of using the 105 dB, we use the 102 dB reference, we can see that actually we only need 120 watts per channel to provide 103.5 dB peak SPL at the RLP. But nevertheless, if you're using amplification, I would always say at least have 150 watts of power available for that. This Dolby Atmos home theatre installation guidelines and the main Dolby Atmos theatre installation guidelines will both be in the download pack for you. So I've got quite a lot of information and calculators for you to use. One very important thing I want to emphasize is be very, very careful when you're not using in-wall loudspeakers and using on-wall loudspeakers, because many of those brands are multi-array point source speakers, which means that they have a number of small drive units, and they do that to reduce the depth of the speaker and make the aesthetics of the speaker in the room good. They appear to be more efficient than single bass driver units. Quite often you'll see these speakers having something like 105 dB sensitivity, but in fact they cannot handle significant amounts of power. So you'll see that the maximum power handling might be between 60 and 100 watts, which is far less than the output power that we're putting as requirements. So be very careful when you're calculating them. If you want to use surface mount speakers, then I would say always use a speaker that can withstand high input, that is designed for cinema. Something like the Wisdom P2M or P4M, for example, is a fantastic looking wall mounting solution, which is thin. It's very beautiful aesthetically. Obviously, it doesn't look quite so with the covers off in the picture, but I can assure you it does. And it has a very high power handling capability, and that's sustained power handling. This isn't one of those peak music power output exaggerations that many manufacturers used. That's 200 watts sustained. Okay, final part of this webinar is calibration. So what I would emphasize is you're going to be putting a lot of time and effort into installations, and you want to be charging your customers to calibrate their systems. Calibration has to be part of the cost of your installation. Don't just throw in an amp and speakers and hope for the best off the whoop whoops on the amplifier. That's not going to do it. You need to buy a suitable microphone and stand. Do not use the one that came out of a Christmas cracker that's in the box with the AVR. It's not good. It's not calibrated properly. There are excellent microphones available which include calibration files. I mean, that's a really important statement, that the accuracy of microphones is that important that manufacturers of any decent one will provide you with a calibration file which you can load into Dirac or Room EQ Wizard. And those calibration files will include a 0 and 90 degree measurement so that you can use the microphone upright or pointing at speakers. We stock the Mini DSP UMIC 1, which is a very, very good example. There are many others. The Mini DSP is often used as a reference. But any software worth its salt will accept pretty much any microphone. You want to be using one that doesn't need too much ancillary equipment to operate. So things like the UMIC 1 are actually USB microphones that you can plug straight into your laptop. You want to be using your laptop to calibrate the room. And again, Room EQ Wizard and Dirac both use the software to do that. And how Dirac works, by the way, is that it takes its measurements locally into the laptop that's local to you, and then it uses Wi-Fi to communicate with the super servers at Dirac to provide information and get the calculations back from those, which are then sent by the software into the amplifier. It's really clever stuff. In new installations, this is very important, always recalibrate the room when it's been furnished. Any furnishing change is going to change the room. So Dirac and Room EQ Wizard are both available for the PC and Mac, and Dirac is pretty much the best calibration platform out there. It's built into Arcam and Wisdom processors. It's also built into many other brands. Just so that you understand, Dirac is a bit like Dolby. They don't make any products. They make software and sound environment applications. Dirac processing takes place in a room with remote equipment. It controls the processor over Wi-Fi or LAN, as I said in a previous slide. Be very careful if you're using a more modern computer like a MacBook Pro. You'll be aware that that only has USB-C sockets. So you just want to find yourself a USB A to C adapter. They're really inexpensive, like the one I'm highlighting on the right here. 2 of those are £5. A lot of people don't understand that the USB-C connector actually has USB-A connectors within it. So this is simply a wiring mod, if you like, which provides you with a USB-A connection, which is what the microphone is going to be expecting. So just to go through, on the right-hand side of this image, you can see where in Dirac you can choose the seating position, and it takes measurements according to how you've chosen your arrangement in various points around the listener, so that it can measure the room acoustics and it can level out that curve to meet the ideal for the human ear. You can do the same with a Room EQ Wizard, but you need a little bit more patience and understanding. The backslide here is the Dirac reference curve, which is how the human ear likes to hear sound. You can adjust that, and Dirac will adjust the sound in a room accordingly. One of the things, just to go back to Dirac to understand, is that with Dirac, you want to be aiming for Dirac to be correcting peaks down, not raising depth up, because obviously that's prone to providing distorted sound or making sound not sound how it should be in a cinema. And it's this curve you want to be trying to follow when you're looking at things in Room EQ Wizard. So where Dirac's not available, or for example, I mean, I've used Room EQ Wizard with invisible series speakers mounted in ceilings and walls in rooms to adjust Sonance DSP amplifiers. Room EQ Wizard is brilliant for that. It's got a built-in SPL meter. It's got a built-in waterfall measurement. It measures SPL curves. And you can download what they call house curves to calibrate against. One of the things about Room EQ Wizard that you need to consider, though, is that it expects the amplifier to be in the same room as the speakers. And in many cases, certainly in CI, that's not the case. And that presents a problem, because Dirac is designed to work with the amplifier out of the room. Room EQ Wizard is not. So the best way to do that is to get a utility like AirParrot, which is really inexpensive. It's a very, very useful utility anyway. An AirParrot, which is available for the PC and Mac, enables PCs to be able to AirPlay or Chromecast to devices like Apple TV, Musicast, Chromecast devices. The problem with that is that any casting audio system, even Bluetooth, has latency. Room EQ Wizard is so well designed that it's even allowed for that. And you have in the software a wait for timing reference checkbox. So when I was calibrating Invisible series in a large mansion last year, I used that. And what happens is when I start the calibration or the measurement, the software sends a chirp and it waits to hear the chirp back so it can exactly time align the microphone to the sound output of the casting device. I'm going to try to put together an application note for you on that, which will probably make things a little bit easier. Don't expect that in the pack tomorrow, but if you contact me or our tech department, then we'll be able to provide that in the future. And it will certainly be something we provide on future hands-on cinema sessions. Okay, that's the close of Home Cinema Essentials Modules 1 and 2. I'm going to open for questions in a second. Again, I would thoroughly encourage you to come in on Module 3, because I'm going to teach you a lot of the myths and truths about speaker placement, screen placement, projector placement. I'm going to teach you about HDMI. I'm going to teach you about chroma subsampling. There's loads and loads of stuff that's worth tuning into on that. But for now, I'm going to go back to the Q&A window. Bear with me a second, and I'm going to see what questions we have. So one of the questions, which is from Gavin Saunders, do we receive a certificate? Yes, we will send out certificates for the training for those attendees. We obviously have something that can track that. We will send you, bear with me just a second, I'm just trying to recover my cursor from PowerPoint. We will automatically know who has and hasn't attended this. So we will, I'll speak to our training department and make sure that we can organise that for you. Martin Hodkinson has said, when will the third webinar link be active to sign up? I should say within an hour of this, if you don't mind bearing with us. And I will send you a link, an automatic link in an email with a link to the documentation so that you can sign up for it as well. I have one from an anonymous attendee. Hi, I'm just checking on the timings for this. My chaps did phase 1 and 2 of this separately last time, and they were an hour each. You mentioned just before this, it's 1 and 2 together. So is this 2 hours? No, obviously we have exceeded the 1 hour threshold, only slightly. You have actually received everything that was in modules 1 and 2, and that's why we combine them together. Yes, it's if you come back to this course, it's just over an hour, and the course next week is expected to be about an hour as well. Dermot McCormack has asked, is there online training for Arcam AVRs? Yes, if you go to habitat.co.uk and go to our training section, you will see that Arcam are running separate training for Dirac, which I would thoroughly recommend. Now that you've seen this and you understand what it is you need to do, then I would highly recommend you go and view that. When calibrating 2 subwoofers, do we have any tips? Yes, I do. I would recommend that you use Room EQ Wizard to look at placement. Download it now; it's well worth it. It's great fun if you really want to get into designing cinemas. You will find that a lot of acoustic specialists use Room EQ Wizard. Might be a bit daunting at first, but there's loads of YouTube and documentation on it, and that's going to help you look at things like phase and subwoofer size and where you want to set the roll off on subwoofers, etc. So hopefully that's helpful to you, Paul. Are we going to be doing module 3 another time? Modules 1 and 2 are great. Thank you for that, Will. Really appreciate your feedback. Yes, module 3 is the first one of module 3 is next Monday, but we will be doing repeats of this because it's been a really popular and oversubscribed course. Daniel Whedon has said, I've been asked to install an Atmos height row with a 2.1 meter ceiling. What are the implications? Well, basically, Dolby don't recommend you go below 2.3. If you have a height of 2.1, then what's going to happen is the amplifier is going to calibrate down the output of that loudspeaker. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's probably better than not having Atmos speakers, but you will find that the calibration system will turn the volume down quite significantly on that, because it's kind of too close to the listener and you're not getting a true spherical Atmos environment. Luke Smith says, sorry, Daniel, I hope that was useful. Luke Smith says, will I be able to watch this back again, please? Yes, you will. So in the download pack, you're going to get a link to the video, which is not something that you can't keep. It's held on YouTube and it has a link to it. And you'll be given this presentation as well. Ajabawi Victory said, what is timber matched? Well, that's question one. So timbre match means that the acoustic properties of the speakers are similar. So they want to have the same frequency range, and they want to ideally have the same sensitivity. Will you be getting a certificate? Yes, we will organise webinar certificates to go out. Luke said, sorry, it's late, no problem. Jason says, in new builds where all speakers are placed in ceilings, how much does this affect sound or Atmos credibility? Well, where all the speakers are placed in the ceilings, that will present a problem. With any Dolby system, really, you need to be putting in-wall or in-room speakers. If you have put in-ceiling speakers in, then you probably want to avoid using the Atmos track and just use 5.1 or 7.1. I hope that's helpful, Jason. James Boyd, we have a calibration mic bought from you guys for Arcam. Will this work with other brands? Absolutely. So if you bought the microphone from us, then it's going to be one of the mini DSP-U mics, one of the best microphones you can get. And why don't you download Room EQ Wizard? You can plug it straight in. Room EQ Wizard will recognize the microphone, and you can also load the calibration file that came with it. So I'd load it and have a play around if you don't want to go out in the sunshine today. I hope that's useful, James. Daniel Whedon, additional side surround speakers are not possible. Yes, I assume that's a question. Yes, they are, but it depends on the processor you're using. In more expensive systems, you can use time alignment modules or things inside the processor to add extra speakers. What you don't want to do is, for example, add 3 sets of sides if only one side or surround is available from the AVR without using some kind of extra processing to make sure that the audio dispersion is organized correctly in compliance with Dolby. Hope that's helpful, Daniel. Sean, is there free room design software available? There is. So we have room design stuff that I've put together, which we keep internally. We will help you with our own software to help you place speakers in a plan. There are open source documents available from Dolby, which, as I said, you're going to get. So keep an eye out for the pack and contact us as necessary. Thanks for that, Sean. Luke Smith says, thank you very much. Sean Harrison, does raised floors affect speaker heights if we have 3 rows of seats? Yes, it does. Really, what you want to do is you want to be, if you have 3 rows of seats, you need to define where your RLP is going to be. And this is why you'll see that quite often when I design cinemas, I put the RLP towards the back of the front row so that it disperses the effect a little bit more across the room. If you have 3 rows of seats and you have raised floors, then you really want to be looking, and this is where in the Dolby spec, they allow for you to raise the rear speaker levels. And what you'll find is that when the amp calibrates, it's going to calibrate according to the speaker height, the reference listening position. So you may need to tone that down for rear listeners, totally dependent on the room. Hope that's helpful. Will Walton, I didn't receive a link to the Wirestorm 4K end-to-end webinar. I will contact you separately, Will, with that and make sure you get it. On another question that's just come in, on the height and side channels, do you recommend normal match speakers to the front and rear or surround speakers? On height and side and surround and front and rear, you should be using the same quality and timbre of speakers. You shouldn't make the fronts better than anything else. All speakers are important in Atmos. Ajabawi, can we install subwoofers in the ceiling using Dolby Atmos? Yes, you can. It's only really recommended in smaller rooms, and you're better off installing in-wall subwoofers. We have 2 series of subwoofers available if you can't have them in the room. You can find more information on that at the Sonance site or on our or if you contact me, I can help you with that. James Boy, can you use calibration for mic and room EQ with a Yamaha AVR? Only to a certain extent, because the Yamaha AVRs will automatically use their own YPAO calibration system. And I don't believe, certainly on the lower end of the amplifiers, you can make any frequency adjustments. That's going to be made inside the AVR. But what Room EQ will help you do is get the acoustics of the room better, which is going to improve the results with YPAO. Mark Harris says, thanks for another great webinar. I learned so much in the last few weeks. That's great. I'm really pleased, Mark. That's what it's all about. Will said, thank you. Diresh said, are we able to view any older webinars that we've missed? Yes, there will be links on our website for all of that. Stephen Browning said that he can't see the RCAM training on the Habitat website yet. I'm sorry about that, Stephen. We'll make sure that's corrected within the next couple of hours. And finally, the question is from Peter Twine. In a baffle wall, would you still recommend the front, left, and right be angled to the Dolby standard, or will the angle be achieved flat mounted? The answer is you can flat mount. Dolby's references now, and you'll see those in the documentations that I give you, they have an in-wall and on-wall reference standard, and it actually follows exactly the same angles as the angular standards. So that appears to be all of the questions, and thank you so much for the positive feedback. That's really great. If you want any more information, or you want to learn more on Module 3, there's anything you want to know specifically about, send those things in to either my address, which is jml@habitat.co.uk, or training@habitat.co.uk, and I'll be pleased to try and get them fitted in. As I said, do join us next week. We've got some great stuff coming up in Module 3. I don't know how I'm going to get the time to put it in a presentation, but I'll work all the hours to do it because I think it's worth you guys knowing. And I really do hope that you found this useful. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you very much for your attendance, and I look forward to seeing you next week.